welcome Bobby Jackson.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Bobby Jackson. It's nice to meet you. By way of introduction, I'll give you a couple of things that are part of my story, that are part of why I am here, and a little bit of background. I live here in Elgin. I have 3 biological kids that I hang out with all the time, and a little bit of my story of how I ended up where I am here, kind of representing the idea of mental health today. I am a former military guy. I went to Iraq a couple of times as a soldier in Iraq, and was a medic there. And when I came back from Iraq, a couple of the funky things was like trying to do the holidays. I remember coming back, and it's kind of like you take a Polaroid picture when you return, and so you kind of just assume, you take a Polaroid picture of all your family and friends and loved ones, and you kind of like, you were in this spot, and then you kind of just assume when you come back, that spot will still be there for you, and you'll just kind of jump back in and resume things as normal. But the reality is, when you're gone for a year and a half, everybody else, whether they mean to or not, they just kind of move on. And they fill that gap. It's kind of like if you were to, if maybe your chore before you left was like mowing the lawn, it's almost like emotionally, they're not going to leave the lawn unmowed for a year and a half. They're going to take care of that, right? And so emotionally, it's kind of the same thing. You used to meet certain needs for folks, and you assume when you come back, you're going to be the same spot with all your friends and family, and they've moved on. They now have other folks to meet those needs. So when I came back from Iraq, I remember that first Christmas being incredibly difficult, being around everybody but not being needed. And it led to just a period of profound depression. There was a lot of things, there's a lot of layers to the story that I won't get into today, but by the following summer, I had gotten to the point of addiction and suicidology and all of that kind of really dark places. And it was through my own mental health journey, through a therapist that I met that helped me recover from those feelings of loneliness, along with some of the PTSD stuff and all of that. That was my initial kind of introduction to mental health. I then, when I finished school, I went to Moody Bible Institute and actually wanted to be a youth pastor. And so I went, I got a degree in youth ministry. I became a youth pastor here in the suburbs at a big church probably some of you have heard about, Christ Community Church down in St. Charles. I was their youth pastor for a while. And the journey kind of returned when I was studying a series about Jesus' emotions. I was like, it's going to be cool. People will love this. Like, young people love to talk about emotions. So I'm going to teach a series on Jesus' emotions. I'm going to be the cool youth pastor. We'll do this for summer camp. It's going to be cool, super cool. Everybody's going to think this is so cool. And what actually happened was it wrecked my life. Because when I started to study about Jesus, I realized that the people he always had soft emotions toward were people who were hurting. All of his compassion, all of his sadness, all of his crying, all of his sighs are directed toward people who are hurting. Somebody who's lost someone, somebody who has a disability, somebody who's hungry. All of his soft emotions were towards those folks. And all of his hard emotions were towards people like me, religious leaders in positions of authority that liked it too much. And it was a real train wreck for me to just realize I was moving in the wrong direction and distancing myself from who I thought Jesus really was. And through that series, I re-engaged with my own heart and started to pray through that and said to my wife, we need to make some changes. And I thought that meant professionally I needed to figure out some things. And she said, we should become foster parents. And I was like, oh, that's not what I meant. I don't mean inside my house. And so obviously she's my wife, so she won, and we became foster parents. And then we launched an addiction program for students at our church, a pain and addiction program. and realized very quickly that I was wildly out of my depth with my undergrad in youth ministry, did not know all of the things I needed to know about the psychology that happen with addiction. So I went back to school at the University of Chicago to study mental health and to get my degree as a licensed clinical social worker. And so that became kind of just began this journey of really engaging in the mental health world and trying to understand the mental health world, and trying to do that from a Christian's perspective. So I was doing it in youth ministry. Eventually, I left regular church staff youth ministry to do some kind of missions work, but ended up launching Rally Point Counseling, and I'm the clinical director and founder, and I work there as a therapist. So by way of expertise and trying to engage in this material, I have a very personal buy-in to it, but also some expertise. And I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, and I'm going to bridge some gaps that I don't usually recommend to therapists, because I don't think therapists should be your primary source of theology. So if your therapist is trying to teach you theology, I think you should always double-check it. So I'm going to bridge that gap as a therapist in this talk, but I don't recommend that other people do that unless they tell you that they're doing that, because that's kind of crazy. Because most therapists are not trained in theology. They're trained in therapy. So they should do therapy, and theologians should do theology, and I'm going to do both anyway. Okay. So the question that I want to ask today is, as Christians, how should we view mental health? You guys are in the middle of a series on worldviews, and you're talking about this idea. But it's an interesting question to think about as Christians. What should be different about our perspective of mental health? Is it the same as everybody else's? Do we just we have our Christianity and we have our mental health? Do we do these as different pockets, like quadrant? We have a physical health and a mental health and a social health and financial health. I don't know. We separate these into different things, or are they all, or is there some other difference between our perspective? Are they all one thing? And how should our day-to-day lives be different because of our Christianity, especially in regards to our understanding of our mental health? Or for instance, as I bring up the holidays, how should we as Christians engage with the hardest time of the year for many folks in terms of mental health? As was kind of referenced earlier, the holidays for many of us is the greatest time of joy, gift-giving, togetherness, being with family. But for many other folks, those same joys are what bring into stark contrast their lack of joy, their conflict, the fact that they have to go home to something they're not looking forward to, or they don't have a home to go to, and they deal with a profound sense of loneliness. So the question is, how, from a Christian perspective, should our mental health be different, and practically speaking, when there's something hard going on? And you guys have been engaging with Genesis 1 through 11, right, for the series. So I was like, oh, great, I really like those passages, some really good stuff about mental health right in there, right? I don't know if you guys are reading those passages along, but there's crazy stuff that happens in Genesis 1 through 11. But there's this one theme that I want to point out that I think is really important, really integral to your understanding as a Christian of who you are and your understanding of your overall health. And this is the line of being made in God's image. So in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, in the creation story, we see God create all of the different things. He creates them and he declares them good. And then he creates humankind. And it says, this is what it actually says. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So we are made in God's image. And interestingly, so that story is if you read the first chapter of Genesis, it is the creation story. It's this very lovely story where everything is good. And so a question mark that I have is, do we maintain that goodness later? And the answer is yes, because in Genesis chapter 5, which is right before the flood, it comes back. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he created him in his likeness, male and female, he created them. He blessed them and named them man when they were created." That's just before the flood. And then in Genesis chapter 9, right after the flood, it comes back. For whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man his blood shall be shed, for God made man in his own image. Okay, so we know for sure on every side of creation, both the good side, pre-sin, pre-fall, and after the fall, and not only after the fall, but after the flood when he brings them back. So this kind of brings some different kinds of questions to mind, but the ones I want to highlight today is the idea that people are made in God's image. And because of that, we display his image. Parts of his image are reflected in every person. And therefore, every person is innately valuable. Like the art reflects the artist, we are reflections of the greatness of the person who created us. And so we carry value not based on ourselves, but based on the one who created us. So every person is created in God's image. At the Counseling Center, this is one of the things we bring up as one of our core values, because we get asked to work with folks all along all the spectrums, right? Some folks have profound mental health issues, but the folks that most people have the most difficulty seeing value in are folks who do something wrong. And at our center, we work with folks who have been abused, but we also work with folks who are abusers. And one of the things that we constantly remind ourselves is every person is made in God's image and has innate worth, and I'm going to treat them as such. So this is the beginning of one of the things that I would say is really important to understand, is different about Christians and our view of mental health. When you see somebody who has an issue, has done something wrong, or has an addiction, one of the pieces, one of the things about Christians and the difference between us and the rest of the world is we have an onus on us to see their value, to work to see their value, because God has told us they're made in his image. The second part of that is, because we are made in his image, I think the other thing I would bring up in there is, what does that really look like in terms of emotions, in terms of mental health? And I think that one of the really cool things about that is it starts to bring to mind the image of Jesus. But there are some misunderstandings I want to talk about before we start to get into the image of Jesus as he displays proper, healthy mental health from the view of God and somebody who lived a life perfectly. But there are some misunderstandings about mental health first. So what are some of the misunderstandings about mental health? That in particular, we as Christ followers or folks who are interested in faith are prone to. And I think there are two primary ways. There's probably a lot, but I'm going to put two on a spectrum, okay? And the two on a spectrum is, one is we are more prone than others to ignore emotions. Many folks who are Christians are like, I should just completely ignore emotions. If I show them, it shows that I'm weak. Or maybe it's that I don't believe hard enough. I'm like not really believing my Christianity, and so I'm going to try to ignore these. Or I shouldn't feel bad because I should just have more faith. And some folks go so far to think that you can be cured of mental health issues if you just have the proper spiritual beliefs. Right? I'm going to probably carefully frame this in terms of there's a generational gap here between the left and the right side of my screen here too. I think the older generations in general, Gen Xers and Boomers, are more on the left side, right? They tend to say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and that kind of faith. And so they're like, you should believe the right things, prescribe the right beliefs. I've seen folks in churches oftentimes say well, if you just pray this, or you let go, or you obey Jesus' command to stop being anxious, just do it, just harder, just do it more, harder, faster, stronger, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? On the other side are folks who allow their emotions to lead their lives. This is the other mistake I think people do. Which is the emotions play too big of a role in decision making and in the lives that we lead. And I would say, in general, that is our younger generations, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and those of us that are millennials are super confused, have no sense of identity. We don't know what we're doing at all, right? Some of us are way on one side, some of us are way on the other side, and we are the problem because we raised the Gen Alphas, so it's our fault. I'm a millennial. There you go. But I do think there's been this swing, this massive swing. And so I want to just propose to you that maybe let's look at Jesus to try to understand what this can look like as a healthy thing. There's a handful of examples. So the question is, what did Jesus's emotions or mental health actually look like? Did Jesus ignore his emotions? Did he ignore his emotions? Did he shut them down? There's actually a ton of examples of Jesus' emotions throughout the Gospels. There's stories of him weeping. Do you guys remember the story of Lazarus? When Lazarus dies, and it's interesting because Jesus doesn't weep when he hears that Lazarus dies. He weeps when he meets with his sister, and she is weeping. And he immediately feels that tenderness and that empathy and that sense of connection. And he's not actually weeping over Lazarus' death at all because he knows he's about to raise him from the dead. Which leads to a bunch of questions like, was that cruel? What if Lazarus was in heaven and you just yoinked him back? That seems rude. But never mind, totally different topic. You can get into that some other time. We're talking about emotional health right now. But he feels that sense of connection. He weeps with Martha, with Mary, right? There's another passage where he weeps in sadness over sin. He's walking towards Jerusalem, and it says that he starts to weep over Jerusalem. He's sad over just the wrongness that goes on in the world. He doesn't shut that down, and he doesn't do it secretly. He weeps in front of all of his disciples, kind of publicly, as if it's okay to enter those emotions of sadness. There's a couple of examples of Jesus sighing. I think those are my favorite examples of his emotions. One example, it says the Pharisees came to him and began arguing with him and seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him, and he sighed deeply. I like that. I just think it's really interesting to picture Jesus actually taking he's so stressed out by these guys that he's got to take a second before he answers, and he actually answers kind of angrily. And the sigh, if you look at okay, I don't know Greek, but I do know how to Google. So if you look at what's behind it in the Greek, that sigh is actually a sigh of despair. He's actually really profoundly sad when he sighs that time. There's another time he sighs over a deaf man in Mark chapter 7, where a guy comes to him and he's deaf, and it's just before he prays. He takes a big sigh. And that one is not the despairing sigh. It's a different sigh. I looked him up because I was curious if they were the same one, and they're different. But it's just a sadness over it looks like the brokenness of the world. This guy has got a disability, and he's just like, this is not the way I created things, is the kind of the feel that I get when I read that passage. There's other examples of Jesus sleeping or resting or realizing he needed a break. Right? He takes a lot of breaks. There's examples of him withdrawing in Matthew chapter 14, 13. And you guys know the story of him sleeping in a boat. He's so exhausted, right? There's a storm. And that's a weird story because I picture the boat going, and him still being asleep. So either he really trusts his disciples or he was just super unconscious, right? It's kind of a crazy story. And then he wakes up and calms the storm. There's times where he commands people to take breaks, to take rests, to kind of give in to the physical part of his body. In Mark chapter 6, he takes a rest. In Luke chapter 5, it says he often withdrew to lonely places to take breaks. So it appears as though engaging with emotions is actually a godly trait, right? Meaning it's a trait God has. And so when we engage in our emotions, it's something that looks like, that is part of our image-bearing nature. But on the flip side, the idea of giving into our emotions, right? So in this generation, I'm going to go down a little tiny bit of a rabbit hole. This generation has the opposite problem of ignoring emotions as a general rule. Maybe you don't, but as a general rule, there's this new idea that if I'm anxious, I should just give in to the emotion, which means I should, if I'm anxious, I should avoid. If I'm angry, I should outburst. If I'm scared, I should panic. Or if I don't want to feel any of those, I'll just numb and I'll avoid, I'll distract, I'll put it down. In the book The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt says this is the most anxious generation in history, and he goes on to prove it by saying between the years of 2010 and 2018, the rates of depression and anxiety amongst college students doubled, more than doubled. And that was pre-COVID. Right? Then we took that anxious generation and we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to send even more stimulation your way, but we're not going to give you any of the coping tools that you need to deal with it. So we're going to isolate you, put you on video with people. We're going to constantly send you little. We're going to send you little 15-second clips of video instead of 5-minute clips because YouTube wasn't good enough. We needed to invent TikTok so you could get lots and lots and lots of stimulation, right? And we're going to make sure that the algorithm favor people who are really rich and beautiful, so you feel really insecure about yourself, because instead of being exposed to majority normal people, we're going to expose you to the rich and famous all the time, and you're going to think you're abnormal, poor, broken, ugly, right? Welcome. And then, just to make sure you heard it, we're not going to give you any tools to deal with it, right? And so it's really, honestly, no wonder that this is the most anxious generation in history. Nobody's ever been asked to deal with the amount of information that you've been asked to deal with so few skills. It's a risk. It's a risky thing to do. I'm doing it. So an election just happened, and I don't know if you have noticed, and I'm not going to speak to either side, but I don't know if you've noticed the messaging that came from both sides was that if you vote the other way, you are condemning humankind to the worst leader in the history of the universe. I don't know if you noticed that both sides use that kind of language. That language was never used pre-2010. This is the first generation. This is your first time voting for many of you. Nobody else was asked to deal with that kind of expectation or that kind of drama or that kind of if you do this wrong, you have ruined our country kind of language. That's new language. And the reason is the algorithm favors the extreme, right? It's a pretty wild world right now that you are being asked to deal with. So the typical go-to is well, then I'll just withdraw. I'm just going to give in. I don't have the tools, so I'm just going to do whatever. And which creates, anxiety actually has its power when people give in to anxiety. If you run from something you're scared of, it will get scarier, right? So especially with anxiety, what anxiety is, it is our fear response system going off in the context of something that is not deserving of the fear response system. And if you let it go, what it does in your body is it propagates. It gets worse and worse and worse over time. So what does Jesus do? In Mark chapter 11, I think this is a really, really interesting passage. Really, really, I had not noticed it. I actually just really recently noticed. Only, I think 2 weeks ago, I was reading this passage. It says, and he entered Jerusalem, he went into the temple, and he looked around at everything. I didn't notice this passage before because I know the second passage that's coming. He looked around at everything, and as it was already late, he withdrew to Bethany with the 12. On the following day, so he took a day off before doing this. As they were coming to Jerusalem, he entered the temple and he began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry out anything that was in the temple. And he was teaching them and saying, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him. But because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching, and when evening came, they went out of the city. I had never noticed when I've read that Jesus overturned the tables before, I never noticed that he waited a day. He went in, he observed everything, he took a break, and then he showed his anger. He didn't have an outburst that was giving in. He actually took a break to consider it, and then went back in, drew a hard boundary, and said, no, this is not what it's meant to be. As Christians who are made in his image, I don't think we're called to either ignore our emotions, because they are part of our image-bearing nature, nor let them run your life or take over. Instead, we're called to take intentional action. Take intentional action. So I want to give you a tool, as I'm coming to a close, a concrete tool for the holidays. Because to me, the holidays are one of the most challenging times, especially in the mental health world. We engage with a lot of folks who really struggle, and I want to give you a tool. So my tool is really simple. We call it the Holiday Survival Roadmap. So how do you manage the holidays? I treat it like a road trip. So maybe you actually go on a road trip, maybe you don't go on a road trip. But this is how I deal with it. And I've got a slide up here, and I'm going to give you a QR code if you want to download it, this actual tool. But it's about intentionality. The first thing that I always do is I think through what's coming. Think through, okay, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, or a different holiday that you celebrate, what's coming? And what are the potential points of stress? Right? There's going to be some potential points of stress. Then I think through what are my guardrails? What are the actual limits that I'm going to have in this? If somebody says blank to me, am I going to deal with it, shut down? Am I going to walk out? What are my actual limits? What are my actual boundaries in the middle of this conversation? There's going to be a limit that I have. So when I say don't avoid, don't ignore, don't give in, it actually means knowing this is how much I am capable of handling, and this is across the line for me. So knowing that in advance, thinking through that in advance. Thinking through safety for some of you. So I talk about putting on your seatbelt, thinking through safety. Thinking through my playlist, meaning what are the things that I have, what are the tools I have, what are the ways I can take my mind off of it. Maybe my roadside assistance, maybe my traveling companion, maybe there's somebody that you can take, maybe there's somebody you can call. But actually thinking through what do I have, what are those kinds of things. And then I think through my, I would say the speed limits. In other words, what are the warning signs that I'm going past? So for me, maybe that's like there's a feeling in my neck that I start to feel like the heat. When I start to feel the heat, I know that I'm starting to get angry and I'm going to have an outburst. So before I actually swing over, what are the warning signs? Another thing that I always tell my wife, if my car looks messy, I'm stressed, right? That's a warning sign because my car's usually clean. If it's not clean, it's a sign. My office, if it's messy, I usually keep it clean. If it's messy, I'm stressed. And so it's thinking through those things intentionally ahead of time allows me to actually engage. And that's what it is to do good mental health work, is it's never about avoidance. It's always about engagement. It's never about, like a lot of folks go to therapy and they think, I'm just going to vent. There's a venting aspect to therapy that can be helpful, but if you talk about your anxiety and don't do anything, it actually makes your anxiety worse because you reinforce the same thought patterns. There's a lot of therapists that don't think about that. So if you have a therapist who doesn't challenge you and make it worse sometimes, question the therapist. So I'm going to have you put up the QR code for that tool so folks can actually pull that tool if you'd like it. I have one other QR code if you're interested in having, there's some folks who need more significant help. We have a group that's going to be just a survival of the holidays kind of group that may be helpful to you. Rally Point is one of the counseling centers that is a sponsor with Judson. We sponsor, I don't know if that's the right word. Partner's the right word, yeah. We don't pay you to put our name up here, but just as a tool so you have it. So I'll also have the QR code if you want for this is for a group that's going to be a coping with the holidays kind of group. That's going to meet, I think, 5 times throughout the holiday season. But where I want to land with you today is I'm going to come back to the 2 ideas. As people who are made in God's image, your emotions are not a bad thing. And if you have parents who tell you they are, you can tell them I said. They're not a bad thing. They're a good thing. They're part of your image-bearing nature of God. Jesus showcased his emotions. But also, as people who are made in God's image, your emotions do not need to lead your life. They're not in charge. They're important. They're helpful. They're barometers. They're thermometers. They tell you what's going on, the temperature of your life. But they're not in charge, and you are. And you get to lead your life. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you so much that we get to bear your image, that we get to showcase your image. We thank you for making us and making us good. You've declared humankind good because we're made in your image. And so I just thank you for the way that you created us, the beauty, the uniqueness, the creativity that is innate in every human being in this room, and the way that we show off your traits of love and kindness and gentleness and strength. And so I just thank you for building those kinds of things into us. And I praise you for your creative work. And Lord, I pray your blessing over this group of folks as they leave today, that they will engage with some of these ideas of engaging with mental health, feeling emotions the way Jesus did, and taking charge of them, doing something about them when it's relevant, when it's valid. So we ask that you would help us follow you well and live in your likeness. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.